And tonight I was going to present to you the conquest of Peru. However, because of some technical problems that we're having here, I'm in Peru. And sometimes there's problems that jump out of nowhere. And tonight is one of those nights. And unless we can fix this in the next 2 to 5 minutes, I will have to postpone this until next Wednesday. And the idea was to present to you the enormous task that Francisco Pizarro put upon himself to go and look for gold in the great empire of the Incas, which was at that time run by none other than Atahualpa Yupanqui. I'll give you a brief idea before you can see any of the images that I had prepared. Just to give you a brief story, Francisco Pizarro was born in Trujillo, Spain, and it was around 1478, roughly 1478. His dad was a warrior, a soldier, who did not recognize him as a legitimate son. In those days, being a legitimate son did carry a lot of weight. If you were considered I guess you might call him a bastard, which is a child that is born out of wedlock. In those days, it was very important that you do become a member of a family in which you were a legal child or an accepted legal child. Let's put it that way. Anyhow, there's not too much of his history when he was young, except the fact that he never learned how to write or read. Even as an adult, he never learned how to write or read. And because of the amount of poorness or poverty in that area where he lived in Trujillo, he was you might say, one who watched over hogs. That was his duties. And he didn't want that anymore. So at the age of 17, he decided to join the army. At that time, the kingdoms, because Spain was not considered a country as of yet, not like we know it today, because today the peninsula of Spain is divided between Portugal on one side and the rest of it is Spain. In those days, there were the kingdom of Castilla and the kingdom of Aragon and the kingdom of Navarra, and obviously the kingdom of Portugal. Well, down below where Francisco Pizarro was born, it was considered La Extremadura. What does the Extremadura means? If you translate it literally, it's the extreme, are the lands that are extremely below from the kingdoms of Castilla and the kingdoms of Aragon. And so he was born into an area which was not recognized as any kingdom whatsoever. However, out of that area, there was another conqueror who came out of there, which was out of Medellin, which was further south of Trujillo, and he was Hernán Cortés. He's the one who conquered Tenochtitlan in what now we consider Mexico. Hernán Cortés went up against Moctezuma, and obviously he defeated the entire empire there. But one of the things that Hernán Cortés, they say, it's not proven, but they say that he shared with Francisco Pizarro when they met in Spain, was that if you latch on to the leader, in this case, he latched on to Moctezuma, later on Pizarro was going to latch on to Atahualpa. If you latched on to the leader of all of these indigenous people, they became in a state of shock, not really believing or understanding how is it possible that this almost deity was able to be captured by somebody who apparently they considered inferior. Anyhow, Francisco Pizarro decided that he was going to go to the recently discovered lands now known as America. In those days, it was Christopher Columbus in 1492 trying to find species because the Muslims in Constantinople had cut off the opportunity of the people from Italy or in Europe in general to go through the Silk Roads to try to find the species that Marco Polo had so brought into the area of the Europes. And consequently, being blocked off, they still wanted to get spices, so they decided they were going to go in the direction of the west, thinking that they eventually would go around the world, because Christopher Columbus believed that the world was round, not necessarily straight. And he went and he discovered a land, and he was looking for India and looking for the Asian portion of the world, but he only knew that it existed because of Marco Polo. When he bumped into the lands that he eventually discovered and now considered Americas, it was in the Caribbean. He landed in what now is considered the Dominican Republic and Haiti, which is an island by itself. In those days, he was looking for what he thought was India, and that's why the Indians are called Indians, not because that is a real name for them. It's just that Christopher Columbus was looking for India, and he found people. He said, "Oh, those are Indians." Anyhow, that was in 1492. The first notice that Francisco Pizarro had arrived in the Americas was in 1504. He went to, which now is the Dominican Republic, but in those days was called La Española. Now, he, once again, was a soldier because at the age of 17, he joined the army, the whatever army was there in the area which is now considered the kingdoms of Castilla and Aragon. Now, the reason I mention both of those is because Queen Elizabeth the Catholic and Fernando de Aragon married and united both of their kingdoms. And in doing so, they were the ones who eventually paid for the trip for Christopher Columbus to go and discover these new areas. And they also were convinced that, there was more to be found in the Americas because of Christopher Columbus coming back he made 4 trips. But at some of those trips, he would bring back gold, never show a Spaniard gold because immediately he goes after it. Anyhow, what happened there is that he joined the army that was now trying to recuperate lands that the Italians were saying that were theirs and France was saying it was theirs, and they were going into battle because of that. And then Francisco Pizarro joined at that time the so-called army that was defending that portion of the kingdoms. And eventually he landed in La Española, which is now the Dominican Republic. But what he did there was, as a soldier, he was assisting or helping other Spaniards that were there to try to conquer some of the Indians that were there, the indigenous people that lived there. And of course, in those days, when they bumped into these indigenous people, they always considered them inferior. As a matter of fact, in many cases, they even thought that they didn't even have a soul, that they were not a la par with them. But that was a very short time he was there, and he eventually went down south in a portion of a ship that took him down into Panama and what now is Panama, and portions of the northern part of Colombia. He was there and he learned a lot of the Indians that were there that were actually repulsing them or trying to go against them. He found out that one tribe was using poison arrows, and when he came back on a second trip, he recognized that those are the tribes that he did not want to mess with, so he decided to go onto the other tribes. But during this time, he was also in association with a guy by the name of Vasco Núñez de Balboa. Vasco Núñez de Balboa was an individual who was a true conqueror. He was in there and he wanted to go for the gold, but he was the one who discovered the Pacific Ocean. He was in a position of doing so because of his military commanding presence. But there was another guy by the name of Martín Fernández Enciso. He was a lawyer, and he had convinced the kingdoms that he should be one that would go and have ships going, and he would be able to gather certain soldiers and people, and among them was Vasco Núñez de Balboa. But when I told you before that they confronted a trip using poison arrows, the observation of Vasco Núñez de Balboa was, let's get out of here and let's go further west, because of the fact that we're going to be dying here, because there were several Spaniards who were already died because of the poison arrows. And so Enciso, Martin Fernandez Enciso said, no, we're not moving, we're going in. And he said, no, wait a minute, you're going to a suicide. And apparently the troops there favored Vasco Núñez de Balboa, to the point that Enciso was so rebellious that Vasco Núñez de Balboa made him a prisoner and sent him back to Spain. Well, that probably was a mistake, because Enciso was well connected in Spain and started a investigation, or started a problem for Vasco Núñez de Balboa, telling the king that this Vasco Núñez de Balboa was doing a whole bunch of things that probably were not even true. But he was making a point that Vasco Núñez de Balboa was not the right guy, because he was taking things that were belonging to the king, because in those days, whatever treasures you found, gold, silver, or precious stones, you were supposed to give the king a fifth, 20%. And Vasco Núñez de Balboa got a bad reputation because of Enciso. And then, of course, the governor of then, it was not called Panama as of yet, it was called Nueva Castilla. And what happened there is that Pedrarias Dávila did not trust Vasco Núñez de Balboa too much, but at the same time recognized that he was one hell of a conqueror, one hell of a guy to go on and confront the Indians. And he more or less allowed him to go and do the things that he was doing, which was going now north and then going south, because he had heard that there was a big body of water, and he wanted to confirm himself. And in the year 1529, he saw the entire Pacific Ocean. He saw not the entire, but he saw the ocean itself, and it was humongous. And he saw it as a humongous amount of water. And he went down there and he had the flag in his hand, and he said, for the king, for the La Española. And he actually was really excited, but he actually was able to find a portion, and he didn't call it the Pacific Ocean, he called it the Southern Ocean, Mar del Sur. But because of Enciso's tattletaling, if you will, the king told Pedrarias Dávila on a written notice, check Vasco Núñez de Balboa, because there's something that is not right with him. By this time, Pedrarias Dávila was so entrenched in the idea that Vasco Núñez de Balboa was trying to gain power for himself, that he accused him of treason, and in doing so, caused him to be decapitated. Enciso was there, right there in the plaza, the main plaza that they had there in what now is Panama, and they chopped his head off. Vasco Núñez de Balboa died without necessarily being properly processed through whatever court system that they had. He was just taken and said, you're a traitor, and out goes his head. Meantime, by the way, Pedrarias Dávila had told Francisco Pizarro, go and arrest Vasco Núñez de Balboa, which he did. And because he did so, he did obey the governor, he was told that he was now going to be given land and Indians to work this land. They used to call them encomiendas. And it was, an encomienda was the permission to be able to exploit the Indians, to work for them, whether it be mining or whether it be in cattle raising or whether it be in any type of labor that Spaniard wanted. Of course, the Spaniards came over there, and as far as they were concerned, working on a regular job was out of the question. I'm a Spaniard and I don't work. I come here to conquer. I come here to look for gold. I come here to see that I can get treasure so I can share them with my king. But to work? No way. They never knew what the word work meant. They did put the Indians through a lot of cruelty. But anyhow, Francisco Pizarro in Panama forms a company called La Compañía de Levante. Levante means picking up. I guess treasures, if you will. He did it between two people. One was Diego de Almagro, which was a Spaniard that he was very close to. And there was another guy who was a priest, guy by the name of Hernando de Luque. Hernando de Luque was very well connected to the governor, and there was another guy by the name of Gaspar Espinosa. Gaspar Espinosa definitely said, "I'm in. I'll get you money so you guys can go down south and try to find out if there is some kind of a big treasure that you guys have been talking about and you guys have been hearing about." And so I think he collected 18,000 gold pesos in those moments. And so they went down there. They went in the trip. They went into the area of Colombia. They went in the area of Ecuador, which now is Ecuador. But all of them almost got killed. It was atrocious. They did not find gold. The Indians were almost killing all of them, and they were dying of hunger because they would land in these places where there was no food except for some of the wild berries that they were able to find. Some of those berries were even poisonous, and they would die of that. So they go back to Panama, and they collect another group of people, another group of boats, and another intention. They go on a second trip, and there was a guy by the name of Bartolome Ruiz, which was a captain of a ship. And then when he was there, he went along because there was not just one ship, there were several ships going down south. Francisco Pizarro said to Bartolome Ruiz, "We're staying here at the island of El Gallo," meaning the island of the rooster. "You go ahead and you see if you can find something. Perhaps you might find something that we have not found so far." So Bartolome Ruiz goes further south, and sure enough, he bumps into a little raft with some indigenous or some natives that said to them, "Yes, there is a great sir, a great leader, a great powerful man by the name of Huayna Capac, but he's further south." And what attracted Bartolome Ruiz's attention was that these natives, it looks like they were like doing business, but they also had things in which they were able to weigh what? Gold. And obviously, once, like I said, you put gold in front of a Spaniard and he goes right after it. Anyhow, he comes back and he tells this to Pizarro. But by that time, there was a new governor. Pedro Arias Dávila no longer was there. The new governor was Pedro Gutierrez de los Rios. And this guy said, "Francisco Pizarro, knock it off. We don't want you to be doing any more explorations. It's costing too much money, and people are beginning to become quite dissatisfied with the things that you're carrying on and doing. So come back." So he sent a guy by the name of Juan Tafur to pick him up. Juan Tafur comes to the island of El Gallo, and Francisco Pizarro says, "No, I'm not leaving," because by that time he had already heard from Bartolome Ruiz that there was gold and there was a great leader, if you will, by the name of Huayna Capac. So he said, "I'm going to do something." And he took his sword out, and right there on the sand of the island, he drew a line that was just straight on. And the line itself was, how would I say this? The line itself was, let me see if I can get this open. Anyhow, the line itself was a dividing line. He said, "Those of you who want to go to Panama and become poor, or even worse, more poor, come over to this side of the line. And those of you who want to come with me to find the gold that," and that time they already had heard the word Biru, B like boy, I-R-U, not Peru, P-E-R-U, but Biru. He says, "Any of you who want to go to Biru with me and become rich, come over to this side of the line." Only 13 guys came over. Juan Tafur, realizing that, he couldn't leave Francisco Pizarro and his 13 men there on that island, he says, "I'm going to take you to another island closer to what now is Ecuador, called La Gascona." And so he sent Diego de Almagro to go back to Panama to get together with Hernando de Luque, his other partner, and get some boats because they were going to go south, further south. So he already had 2 trips, but this was going to be the 3rd trip. And Francisco Pizarro never, ever stopped believing that there was an enormous amount of gold to be had. He just felt it in his bones. So anyhow, Diego de Almagro comes back and he has all kinds of people and weapons and so forth. And he had several ships, and they went into Tumbes, which now is Tumbes, Peru. And they found that there was like a little city, not a big city, but a little city, but it was well formed, well constructed. Let's put it there, with walls and the different places where they lived. And they told them, yes, there was a guy by the name of Huayna Capac. And you say, well, wait a minute, how is it that he understood what they were saying? In one of the previous trips, they had given Francisco Pizarro a native young person. I don't know what age he was. Probably he was around 17 or 18. And that individual was called Felipe Felipillo. And he learned Spanish enough to be able to translate or interpret any of the statements made by some of these other tribes, which they all spoke Quechua. And what happens here is that they say, yeah, Huayna Capac died. They don't know really what he died of, but they suspect that the smallpox, which eliminated in Mexico and Central and South America about 90% of the Indian population of the Americas. Smallpox did that. The Spaniards came and they had already gone through the pandemic of the smallpox, so they were more or less immune, but the Indians were not. And consequently, Huayna Capac died, but he left two boys. One was called Atahualpa, and the other one was Huáscar. Now, Huáscar lived in Cusco, where supposedly that's the home center of the Inca Empire. But also Quito, which now is Quito, Ecuador, that's where Atahualpa lived with all of his warriors. And Atahualpa says, no, I am the Inca, not you. And then Huáscar said, wait a minute, I am the Inca because my mom is a pure blood where your mom was not. In those days, the Inca had access to many women as they wanted, because the Incas were the almost God creatures. They were able to tell you you're going to die today, and you would die today because he would kill you. That's how powerful these individuals were. But anyhow, Francisco Pizarro says, where is this Atahualpa guy? Well, he is coming down from Quito. They didn't call it Quito, but he was coming Quito, and right now he is in Cajamarca. And he's going to be there for a couple of days, or I guess a couple of weeks. And Pizarro says, let's go and see if we can talk to this guy so he can tell us more about it. And who knows, we might be able to conquer them easily, because, we have done other conquering in other situations with other tribes, and they were no big deal. Francisco Pizarro didn't know that Atahualpa had 30,000 warriors. And the amount of people that were with Francisco Pizarro, that were going from Tumbes all the way to Cajamarca. And by the way, to get to Cajamarca requires you to go up into the Andes. I'm talking about 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 meters above the sea level. And there was only 62 of his men of the 168 that were on horseback. And they carried their muskets, they had their swords, they had their lances, and they had their muskets, and they had, I think, around 7 small cannons. I've often wondered, can you imagine, since I live here now in Peru, I lived 6 months down here in Peru and 6 months up in the United States, but I've been through these mountains and I've seen how inclined they are. I've seen how easy it is to fall off a cliff and go way down there and kill yourself. And yet these guys went not knowing what they were going to bump into. They kept on going, looking for Atahualpa. And he arrived at Cajamarca in September of 1532. And I think it was the 16th of September, if I recall right, 16th of September. But anyway, I know it was September, and it was the year 1532. Matter of fact, Pizarro enters Peru in the year 1532. Later on, he dies in the year 1541. He was only 9 years, total amount 9 years in Peru. But anyhow, he gets to Cajamarca, and he immediately recognizes that the plaza where Cajamarca was, the capital, if you will, now it's a capital of the state. They had buildings, so he hid his 168 people, that in particular the 62 that had horses. They hid those, and on top of some of the buildings, the small building, but they were still a little bit high, they had the 7 cannons pointed in certain strategic directions. And he told Hernan de Soto, go and tell Atahualpa that I'm here and I'd like to meet him. I'd like to have dinner with him. Dinner, I don't know what kind of dinner they would prepare, but anyhow, that's what they said. So Hernando de Soto went, and he had a horse that he was able to really impress anybody who watched him ride him. That this horse would actually almost dance and would stand up on 2 legs and would do all kinds of things. And he rode the horse straight towards Atahualpa at full gallop, and then at last minute pulled the reins on the horse, and the horse stopped almost on top of Atahualpa. Atahualpa did not move, yet the saliva of the horse sprinkled on his face. He didn't move. Other of the natives that were around Atahualpa, they were scared and they backed off. Atahualpa immediately sent those to their death. Yeah, sent them to their death. That's how powerful the Inca was. And the Inca, through the interpretation of Felipillo, told Hernan de Soto, tell your leader, tell your boss, or tell your main man, which is Francisco Pizarro, I'll be there tomorrow, not today. I have certain things to do here. Well, what he did that night, he was drinking chicha, which is like a beverage, alcoholic beverage here. And he was they have these thermal baths. The Inca used to, let me tell you this. The Spaniards that came over were not very clean. They did not keep themselves clean as the Indians did both in Mexico and in Peru. They used to take steam baths. They used to take warm baths. They were taking several baths a day sometimes. Not all of them, but most of them. They were always conscious of the fact that they had to have a clean body. Spaniards did not. Can you imagine how those Spaniards smelled with the clothes that had been perspiring upon it? And on top of that, they had their metal, what do you call it? The metal that they had was to protect themselves against flying arrows, or somebody whacking them with a stick, which had a rock attached to it. That was the weapons that they were using. But the helmet that they had was obviously metal. Matter of fact, Atahualpa said, "Why are these people carrying a pot on top of their head? That pot should be used to cook things in it. And why do they talk at night?" Now, when they were talking at night, the Spaniards were praying, because they had also realized that Atahualpa had more people or more warriors that they had bargained for. And obviously they were praying on the rosary. They were Catholics. and they were praying, and they were thinking, this is the last day we're going to be alive. So the Atahualpa was, besides the horses, he wanted to kill all of the Spaniards because he figured that they were strange things. However, his dad, Huayna Capac, believed that these people that were coming from the ocean in these floating houses, the boats, were coming because the god Huiracocha had sent them to try to intercede between the civil war that was happening between the two brothers, Huáscar and Atahualpa. And he believed that at that time, even though the wars had not started, he believed that these were like representatives of the god Huiracocha. Their shields shined in the sun, and the armor that they had on top of their body looked like the armor that the god Huiracocha, in the drawings of the god Huiracocha, looks like he had armor too. So he figured perhaps these were the reps of Huiracocha. So he more or less did not want to go after them right away. He wanted to meet him at least and try to see if he could make a decision as to, should I kill him or not? But the mind of Atahualpa, he had never seen a horse. None of these Indians had ever seen a horse and had never seen a cannon blow. They had never heard it, let's put it that way, a cannon roar. So far, they had not seen or heard a cannon, but the horse, they had seen it. And Atahualpa made up his mind. He says, I'm going to kill all of them, but I'm going to spare three of them. One of them is going to be the guy who puts the horseshoes on the hoofs of the horses. That's one. The next guy will be the guy who actually gets on top of the horses and makes them, how would I say this? And makes them, completely at ease. The horse trainer, if you will. But he said the third type of guy, I understand from what they have told me, because Atahualpa had spies throughout his kingdom. And one of the things that they came back and told him is that there was like a little room that all of the Spaniards who had their beards all shaggy and they were all dirty and they looked crappy. Anyhow, they would go in, they would make a line and they would go into this little particular room and they would come out another door, but they would come out obviously shaven, but he didn't know that the guy inside was a barber. He thought it was some kind of a magician. And so he figured the three people among the three that I'm going to save or spare, one of them is going to be that guy that keeps on making the Spaniards young in appearance and probably is a fountain of youth. So three were going to be spared. But destiny had something else prepared for Atahualpa. Atahualpa the next day had his 30,000 warriors surround Cajamarca, up in the hills around Cajamarca. And they had the order not to come into the plaza of Cajamarca. Into the plaza of Cajamarca, Atahualpa came in. He was being carried in a little, like a little carrier. And they had several men, holding up on their shoulders this little type of a chair that Atahualpa was sitting in. And Atahualpa came in with the guys that, make music, musicians, if you will, but there were 2,000 of them. And they had the jokers who were making the fun and so forth. Atahualpa was in a festive mood. He just wanted to see who these guys really were, the Spaniards that they had heard so much about. And there was a priest by the name of Vicente de Valverde who went up to Atahualpa and he said, you have to leave all of your gods because this is the book that is the one that tells the truth. It was the Bible. And so Atahualpa latches on to the Bible and he puts it up to his ear. He doesn't hear anything. He opens it up, doesn't see anything but a whole bunch of little words, and he threw it down. The minute he threw that Bible down onto the ground, That was a signal that Francisco Pizarro gave by saying Santiago a ellos. That was the war cry. When he said Santiago a ellos, everybody knew it was time to attack the people in there. Immediately, Francisco Pizarro, besides killing with his sword a couple of the Indians there, he went right over to Atahualpa, grabbed and pulled them off the litera, or the little carrier there, and he grabbed them, as you've probably seen some of the drawings that I put before when I was promoting this program. And when he pulled them down, the other Indians were being trampled by the horses and being killed. The cannons were roaring, the muskets were roaring, and 2,000 of those Indians were dead. How many Spaniards died? 0, not one. So that to me, militarily speaking, I can see why it was not easy, but why Francisco Pizarro was able to shock the 30,000 warriors. They figured if the Inca went down, these people really must be the reps of the god Huiracocha. And who knows what they can do with those things that fire at you. Fire comes out the edge of this particular muzzle, and people fall down dead, bloody all over the place. We're in a state of shock. And they retreated. And Francisco Pizarro made Atahualpa his prisoner. Once he made the prisoner, he had Atahualpa still be surrounded by some of his keepers, some of his people of trust. And remember that Felipillo may have not been around all the time to be able to listen to everything that Atahualpa was saying, but Atahualpa had heard from some of the people that were around him that got messages that his brother Huáscar had been contacted by the Spaniards on their way up from Tumbes to Cajamarca, and had been one to tell the people of Huáscar that they were in favor of Huáscar being the Inca. So he said, Atahualpa says to this errand boy, go and make sure that General Quisqui actually kills my brother Huáscar. They did. They killed Huáscar. But before they killed Huáscar, they killed his wives, plural, wives. The main one killed his mom, which was not Atahualpa's mom, and he killed his children. And then they threw Huáscar into a ravine, and that was the end of Huáscar and his pretension of becoming the Inca. Francisco Pizarro didn't know this at the time. Francisco Pizarro, though, made sure that he was talking to Atahualpa every single day. They had dinner together. They would make sure he was befriending Atahualpa. Atahualpa was only 32 years of age, and he found Francisco Pizarro interesting, and Francisco Pizarro found him interesting, and so they were comparing notes. One of the things that the Spaniards did do were playing chess. And sometimes, try to imagine this. Atahualpa is in a cage or a cell, if you will, and he's watching Francisco Pizarro's brothers, 2 of them playing chess. Atahualpa was so smart that after watching them play chess several times, he learned how to move the chips. And when one of them was going to make a move, Atahualpa would go, like, no, not that way. Don't do that. You're going to lose. And they thought that was really great, that this Indian, I'm saying now Indian like this, was so smart that he was able to learn to play chess. But Atahualpa was planning to kill him anyhow once he was going to be let free. And how did he do this? First of all, he said, I offer you my sister in marriage to Francisco Pizarro. His sister's name was Quisque Sisa. Quisque Sisa was not only Huáscar's sister, She was also the daughter of Huayna Capac, so she was royalty, true royalty. And so Francisco Pizarro said, I'll marry her, but she has to be baptized because I can't marry somebody who's not a Catholic. And they baptized her, and she became, her new name was Inés Huaylas Yupanqui. And he married her, and later on had, 2 years after that, had Francisca, his daughter, and he had Gonzalo, his son. Gonzalo died at an early age, but Francisca didn't. Francisca went all the way up to adulthood and eventually a fully grown person. But Atahualpa, when they found out that he had sent to kill Huáscar, and then the Diego de Almagro group came in and said to Pizarro, listen, they're already talking about coming over here and killing all of us. I would strongly suggest that if you were able to impress them upon grabbing Atahualpa and pulling him down, he definitely, by killing him, you are really going to shock them. And so they were all in favor of killing him. But before we get there, let me go back a little bit and tell you that Francisco Pizarro, when he came in, he was determined to find gold. That was his main issue, finding gold. And so Atahualpa, recognizing that the Spaniards' main goal, their main goal was gold, silver, and precious stones. And he told them in the room called El Cuarto del Rescate, the rescue room, he says, I'll raise my hand, and as tall as I am, and he was quite tall, the tip of my fingers will be the line in which I'm going to fill this room with gold and silver and precious stones. And I'll do this in 40 days. Well, he didn't do it in 40 days, but he did fill the room a lot, not up to where he had said, but a lot, to the point that he brought in, he had his subjects go throughout the kingdom or the empire and bring gold and bring gold and bring silver and bring silver. He latched on in that room, there was an amount of 84 tons of gold and 164 tons of silver. Precious stones, I don't know. But those two amounts, humongous amounts. And what Francisco Pizarro had to do there is take all of that gold and all of that silver and transport it back down. Remember, they're way up there above the sea level. And they had to take it down to Tumbes, where they were going to put it in a ship, go to Panama. And then in Panama, there was no canal there, as of yet. They were to take it there, and then they had to take it over on mules and horses to cross over into the other side of Panama. Remember, Panama still was not known as Panama, and able to get to the Atlantic, which then would be a ship that would take all that, take a fifth, 20% of the gold to the king. That was a major task. But anyhow, Pizarro marries Quisque Sisa, now Inés Huaylas Yupanqui, and you know, Atahualpa really thought he was going to be set free. And in the process of his mind, he said, when I'm free, I'm going to kill each one of these characters. Every one of them is going to die. And apparently, the Spaniards sensed that more or less this was what's happening in the mind, or at least the planning of Atahualpa. Anyhow, they condemn him, and now they are going to execute him. How are they going to execute him? They offered him two things: either you die by the stake, in which you're going to be burned because you're not a person who believes in the Catholic religion. You have many women, and you killed your brother. And they made a whole bunch of charges against him. And when he was there at the stake, ready to be burnt, Vicente Valverde, the priest, said, you know something? Dying burnt is a lot of pain. He says, why don't you choose dying by the garrote? The garrote was a machine. I won't say a machine. It was something. It was a metal deal that came from first of all, you sat down like this. Let's see if I can put it up here. Something like this. You would be sitting down, and out of here, the back, there was like a big screw that would come back, and the guy would turn it, like if you're trying to close the water flow. And of course, the screw had a tip that would go on the other side, a sharp pointed tip. And when he was going around and around and around, that tip started to, and then eventually went in the back of the head of the person and actually broke into the spinal cord connection between the spinal cord and your skull. That, according to the Spaniards, was a more pleasant way of dying than being burnt alive like Joan of Arc, I guess. Anyhow, he said, "Yes, I'll take the garrote." And curiously enough, the garrote was promoted as a more merciful way of dying than being hung. You know, when you hung up somebody like hanging him with a rope. And to just look at the tip of that thing going in the back of your head, to me, would have been, whoo, no. But anyhow, that's the way Atahualpa, by the way, Atahualpa was baptized because that was a condition. If he got baptized, he was going to be killed or executed with the garrote. And that's the way he died. And they say that the name that was given to him as a Christian was now Francisco Pizarro's name. Anyhow, that's the way that happened. Now, what do the Spaniards do now? General Quisqui says the Incas are now saying to themselves, wait a minute, we conquered the Tahuantinsuyo, which was 965,000, more than that, 965,000 square miles. It came, the empire, the Inca Empire, started from the lower part of Colombia all the way down to Chile. And it went touched Bolivia and touched a bit of Argentina, but that was the entire Inca. They had over 40,000 kilometers of roads in which the Chisquis would run. Those were like the people that rode on the horses. They would carry the mail in the United States. Can't remember what the name of those guys, but anyhow, the Chisquis were able to run, and they would be relieving. Another runner would be waiting for this one particular run, and the runner would give him whatever he was getting, and he'd keep on running. And they say that the Inca even had fresh fish to dine, because the Chisques were able to carry those pieces of fish, because, you know, we're talking about as you go up high into the mountains in the Andes, it becomes colder and colder. You didn't have to worry about the fish decomposing because of the heat. But anyhow, that's the story. That's part of the story. But anyhow, what happens there is that the Spaniards kept on taking advantage of the fact that many tribes had been conquered by the Incas in a very brutal manner, and they had been subjected to the imposition of saying, now you have to give us a certain amount of tribute. We're going to marry some of our generals to some of your daughters, some of the queen daughters or some of the princes, but you are going to be forced to give us tribute. And you can continue with your religion or what have you, but you are going to speak in Quechua, not necessarily to the other languages that they were speaking. But those people were not happy and content. After you were conquered by some of the Incas, you didn't go, wow, I'm so glad now we become an Inca. No, A lot of those individuals, a lot of those tribes were very hateful towards the Incas. So now the Spaniards took advantage of those tribes that were actually still very, very pissed at the Incas, because the Inca side, they still had their tribe, their warriors that were still willing to die for the next Inca that may pop up, which was Manco Capac. But Manco Capac was under the impression that if he favored the Spaniards were not going to cause more problems that they had already caused. Well, that was a mistake. The Manco Inca saw that the Spaniards were super cruel, and they had done a whole bunch of things that were not accepted by the Incas, meaning the violation of some of their maidens and what have you. And consequently, he decides to escape and leave the Spaniards, and he formed a group of warriors, 50,000 of them, and went against the Spaniards and almost won, but they captured him. And by the way, when he lost the last battle, he went to a place called Vilcabamba, which was past Cusco, and it was like almost impossible to find him, but they did find him. They brought him back to the Cusco plaza, and they put him to death, and they executed him there. And that was the end, so to speak, of that portion of the Incas. They still had other Incas that claimed to be the Incas. Tupac Amaru, for example, he was the last Inca, if you will. But the way that the Spaniards executed Tupac Amaru, and his wife was Basticida. Her name was Basticida. Yeah, but I think it was Basticida. But anyhow, they were all executed, but Tupac Amaru was executed in a way that super cruel. Try to imagine this: 4 horses. One, on their tail of the horses, there was a rope tied to one of Tupac Amaru's leg. Another horse rope was tied to the tail of the horse and another leg of Tupac Amaru. The other 2 horses with ropes tied to their tails and the arms of Tupac Amaru. The horses pulled and actually dismembered Tupac Amaru, because here he is, with his arms stretched out, his legs stretched out. And that was done in front of Tupac Amaru's child, one of his young boys. I mean, those are the cruelties that I don't know. It's just, in my mind, it's just too much. But in those days, apparently, that was something they did without even flinching. Anyhow, when Francisco Pizarro came back to Panama before his 3rd trip, he wanted to make sure that no governor was able to block him from going down and looking into this big, vast land to see if he was able to get some treasures. And he went back to Spain. Now, Francisco Pizarro was Hernan Cortes's relative. He was a second uncle, I'm saying. And Hernan Cortes was in Spain at the time, trying to fight over some of the things that he said that he had the right to have in Mexico. And he was there in the courts, and then he saw his uncle, Francisco Pizarro, put in jail when he landed because Enciso, remember? Martín Fernández Enciso, he had created such a bad motion for Vasco Núñez de Balboa, but he also had lent money to Francisco Pizarro, which Francisco Pizarro had not paid him back. And in those days, if you owed money and you didn't pay, you go to jail. I don't know why that ever even came to use common sense. Common sense tells me if you're in jail, how in the hell are you going to pay me? But anyhow, that was something they did. But Hernan Cortes, having the influence of having just conquered Mexico, he had tremendous amount of influence and power. And so he got his cousin out and his uncle out and was able to connect them to Carlos V, the emperor, Charles V, the emperor of not only now Spain, but also of Germany and also of Holland. What happened is that the emperor says, I'd be glad to listen to you, but I don't have the time. I'm going to have my wife, which was Isabel de Portugal, I have her take care of this, and she will actually make sure that you're taken care of. And sure enough, she did. They wrote up a writ giving Pizarro the rights to go and conquer, and whatever he was able to conquer and attain or able or to get, he was to share. He was to share with the king 20%. And they wrote it up so that when Francisco Pizarro came back to Panama, at that time it was not known as Panama, but now it is, he would actually show them, see, I can do as I please. I have the royal permission to do so. Before he came back to Panama, he went over to his brothers, Juan, Hernando, Gonzalo, and a half-brother by name of Martin Alcantara. They, all four of them, came back with him to enjoy and to be conquerors, just like his brother was, Francisco Pizarro. Now, when they gave the permits to Francisco Pizarro, before he went to Spain, Diego de Almagro and Hernando de Luque, his partners in the company Levante, said, you go because you're good at speaking. You may not know how to read or write, but you're good at speaking. I can't go because Diego de Almagro had lost one eye because an arrow came by and took part of it out. So he was missing an eye. And he said that would not look very good in the court. So I'm going to stay here with Hernando de Luque. Hernando de Luque was a priest. He said, I can't go either. So you go. And he went. And when he did get the permission to go conquer, he made sure that Diego de Almagro and Luque were also included. But it turned out to be that the way they wrote it up, Francisco Pizarro had the most to gain, and Diego de Almagro, which supposedly would have been 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3, was not that way. It was almost like 70% Francisco Pizarro, and 15% or 20% Diego de Almagro, and the remaining 10% Hernando de Luque. Now, Diego de Almagro was not happy. He was not a happy camper. And so he claimed that, he went over to Francisco Pizarro and said, what the hell, man? Why am I not getting what I'm supposed to get? When they gave Francisco Pizarro the right from the Rio Santiago, which is up there by Colombia, all the way down to the river Maule in Chile, that was the amount of distance that there was. They gave Francisco Pizarro 200 leagues. I don't know what would be leagues in English. I'll just say probably more than miles. Probably each league has many miles in it. But anyhow, it went down to Chincha, today named Chincha. And Cusco is above Chincha. But Diego de Almagro thought it wasn't that way. He thought that Cusco belonged to him to conquer and to make sure that he ran as well as Francisco Pizarro running Lima. Anyhow, he went over there and he bitched and moaned to Francisco Pizarro. He says, why don't you go down to Chile? At that time, it wasn't called Chile either, but go down in that area because that's your area and you might be able to find gold on your own, just like I did with Atahualpa. And by the way, when they would actually share whatever they had won in the battles of gold, the only guys that were able to get any type of compensation were those who were in the battle. If the other ones were coming up and they arrived a day later, they didn't get anything. And that, of course, put a lot of these guys in a slightly pissed off mood because, she said, wait a minute, we're here trying to fight all these Indians and we don't even get a coin. But no, that's the way they shared whatever they were able to get. Anyhow, Francisco Pizarro sends his brother Hernando. No, he sent he sent Gonzalo and he sent Hernando and Gonzalo into Cusco to reign and to govern Cusco, knowing ahead of time that Diego de Almagro, who is now in Chile, would have been very disappointed because he said, Cusco is mine, not yours. And so when he comes back and he finds out that they had just had a problem with Manco Inca, who had battled them, but they had executed Manco Inca in the plaza of Cusco. He came in and he had a battle with the brothers of Francisco Pizarro, and he puts both of them in jail. One of them escapes from jail, and then the other one he was going to execute, but somebody told him, don't do that, because then you're going to have Francisco Pizarro after you, and you're going to be a big problem. He released them. Big mistake, because this guy turns around, gets the army, and they had the battle called the Battle of Salinas, in which they trapped Diego de Almagro. They put him in jail. They execute him. Remember what I told you about the garrote? The same way they did Atahualpa, that's the way that they executed him. But they even took him to the plaza and cut his head off. Now, Diego de Almagro had a son by the name of Diego de Almagro also. They called Diego de Almagro El Mozo. Diego de Almagro had a son that was procreated when he was in Panama. This kid was no longer a kid. He was a regular man. And he led the Almagristas, those who sympathize with Diego de Almagro, which by the way, they were now in a state of poverty. Some of these guys were begging for food, begging because they never were able to latch on to the enormous amount of gold that Pizarro and his brothers were able to accumulate, even after they had sent the 20% to the king. These guys were like millionaires, but the Almagristas weren't. And the Almagristas, needless to say, they were pissed. So in Lima, the Almagristas went towards the building or the residence of Francisco Pizarro, shouting, "Traitor, traitor, long live the king." Let me go back a little bit. When Francisco Pizarro fathered Inés Huaylas Yupanqui, and Francisca was born, when she was about 5 or 6, he immediately took her away from her mom so that she could be raised in the religion, the Catholic religion, and be taught in the Catholic schools of the priests. So Francisca Pizarro Yupanqui was raised almost like any other Spaniard. So she was just as Spaniard as they come, only she spoke 2 languages. Obviously, she spoke Spanish and she spoke Quechua. But she was the granddaughter of Huayna Capac. She was royalty. But a lady by the name of Inés Muñoz, who was married to Francisco Pizarro's half-brother, Martín Alcántara, both between Inés and Martín, they took care of Francisca. They made sure that she was brought up properly. And I say properly in quotes. And when the Almagristas came in to murder Francisco Pizarro, they were going to go after anything that was connected to Francisco Pizarro because they had blood in their eyes, and they were going to they wanted revenge. They wanted. Francisco Pizarro was having dinner, and he got up and he put his armor on, but he could not put it on completely, and he just pulled his sword out and he started. And one guy pushed Juan Narvaez, one of the guys who was there, towards Francisco Pizarro. Francisco Pizarro ran him through with his sword, killed that guy. He actually killed 3 guys before they actually were able to catch up to him. And one of the sword strokes went right through his neck. And obviously he must have caused tremendous damage and bleeding. Francisco Pizarro, at the age of 63, goes down on the floor and he's bleeding profusely, and he puts his finger in the blood and he makes a cross with his own blood on the cement. And he says, "Please, I need to have a confession given to me." And there was one guy that had a big jar, big old heavy jar, and he says, go and confess in hell, and boom, actually crushed his skull with the big jar, and he obviously killed Francisco Pizarro. This is on the 28th of 28th, I don't know if it was also September, but year 1541. He was actually in Peru only 9 years. The Gonzalo, his brother, was now in a tight situation because the Inés Muñoz de Alcántara. Oh, by the way, in the duel there with Francisco Pizarro, his brother, his half-brother, Martín Alcántara, was also killed. So now it's one brother dead. The Gonzalo, the only brother that was no longer in Peru was Hernando, who had gone to Spain, gone to Trujillo to make sure that the amount of gold that they had was well taken care of in Spain, not in Peru. So he had a tremendous fortune over there, just waiting for the other brothers to come over there. But Hernando was in Spain, but Gonzalo and Juan was killed in one of the battles. Martin was killed in the duel with the people who came in trying to kill Francisco Pizarro and who actually murdered him. And the only one left was Gonzalo. Gonzalo was against the guy who was sent by the king to settle the animosity between the Pizarristas, the guys who followed Francisco Pizarro, and the guys who followed Diego de Almagro. This guy was named as Castro de Vaca. And he was told that Francisca Pizarro was in danger, so he made sure that she did not become in a position of being killed also. Now, when Gonzalo confronted this, I guess he was like a lawyer, but he came with the orders of the king that no longer the Spaniards were going to have encomiendas. And Gonzalo had a tremendous encomienda. He had a mine going and he had cattle, and he had made a lot of money in that little encomienda. Let's call it a farm, if you will. But the order came from the king, says no more encomiendas to anybody, and those who already have to decease, because that belongs to the property of the king. Gonzalo says, no, it's not. So he becomes a rebel against the king, and that immediately caused you to be targeted, to be executed. And sure enough, he was executed. So now it only leaves Francisca, who at the age of 18 leaves Peru. She left certain things working for her here in Peru, producing her money, and she went to Spain, to Trujillo, where she, at 18, is told by Hernando Pizarro that in order to keep the patrimony in one big bag, in one big house, or one big, I won't say bank because there was no banks, it was necessary for her to unite her powers and his power, economic powers, together. So they married. Can you imagine? Uncle marrying his niece? Yeah. So they married and they had 5 children. And this Hernando was so twisted mentally that he wrote in his testament that when he died, by the way, Hernando, when he married Francisca, who was 18, he was 50. So he was like 32 years older than she was, but they still had 5 children. Anyhow, he wrote in his testament that when he died, it was forbidden for her to marry again. And he died, and she married again. She married a young man who was an aristocrat. He had money, a lot of money, and she had a lot of money. And they went all over Madrid, and he went over the different cities that were, a lot of fun that they had. This guy was 20 years her junior. Eventually, she dies. They didn't have any children, but eventually she dies at the age of 63. Funny thing, well, not funny, but coincidental. She died at the same age that her dad died. Her dad, because he got stuck with the blade, but she died of, I guess, some some kind of old age sickness. In those days, reaching 63 or reaching 60 was saying a lot. But she built with Hernando the palace in Trujillo, in the main court, the main plaza. They call it the Palace of the Conquista, or the Conquista Palace. It's still there. It's humongous. They had all the money in the world, and in general, this is what happened. There's not too much more to say about Francisca because she had 5 children, but there's no follow-up history on them. They must have just kind of disappeared or kind of had their own world. But there's not mentions of them doing any real things worthwhile. So that's the end of the story of how Atahualpa, with 30,000 warriors, was able to be taken by a guy who was persistent with only 168 people. And mind you, in those days, not everybody was a soldier. A lot of those guys, they said, I'll use my sword, because everybody had a sword in those days. Whether you were a soldier or not, you had a sword. That's the way you defended your honor, you defended your rights and what have you. But a lot of them were not soldiers. They were there because they wanted to see if they can get some gold. They got gold. Never in the amount that Francisco and his brothers got, but still a lot. Anyhow, thank you for the attention. I will do next Wednesday. I'll go over this same story that I told you, only I have some of the pictures, and it will be done in English again. Anyhow, thank you very much for being here, and hopefully it was enjoyable. Anyhow, take good care. By the way, even though I did it in a recorded fashion, it will be on my page, Roberto Arguello. It will be there, but like you can see, you only see my image in the picture here. But next Wednesday, same time, I'll have it done in the proper way. Okay?